Good morning. Well, good afternoon, Canada. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Kim Randall. I am the founder and CEO of Fair Supply. I'm really excited to join you today. I have been working in this space for a very long time. I'm a lawyer by way of background. I actually started my career in North America and then transitioned into the human rights space when I took the job as International Justice Mission Australia. Yes, an Aussie accent. As Senior Director of Corporate and Legal. And so I was actually responsible for the advocacy for the Australian Modern Slavery Act and saw, what was once a advocacy and academic issue, NGO issue, would move into the space of risk management for businesses. So that was really the reason for the launch of Fair Supply, and we've worked with over 130 companies in Australia in relation to modern slavery reporting compliance, which actually then led to the launch of Fair Supply in Canada. We are headquartered in Vancouver in Canada and now helping Canadian entities prepare for modern slavery reporting. We're currently working, you might have heard of Sobeys, the grocery store, and a few other Canadian entities, and really excited to talk through some of our learnings on the Canadian Modern Slavery Act and then also our learnings from Australia that Canadian entities can apply. So thank you so much for joining us. I will get started. If we just go to the next slide and the next slide, what we're going to cover today, sorry, if we just go back to the agenda, is really an overview of the Forced Labour and Child Labour and Supply Chain Acts and key lessons from Canada's first two reporting cycles, insights from Australian modern slavery reporting regime, and priorities for Canadian entities. We're very aware that you may have limited time and resources, so what your priorities should be to prepare for the next reporting deadline, and then really want to make this webinar as interactive as possible, and so we'll leave enough time for questions and answers and discussions at the end. Please feel free in the webinar to type any questions you have into the chat, and I can try and answer them both throughout the webinar and at the end. If we just go to the next slide, disclaimer, next slide, next slide. Why is there a Modern Slavery Act? And I always start with our why, because there is prevalence of modern slavery in Canada. In fact, according to the Global Slavery Index, Canada has 69,000 people, or 1.8 per 1,000 people living in modern slavery. That is quite high for a country like Canada. And equally as importantly is that Canada imports $20 billion worth of goods at risk of modern slavery. And so you can see that in circumstances, the importation of electronics, garments, gold, textiles, and sugarcane all have a significantly elevated prevalence of modern slavery in their supply chains. And so that is the why of businesses being required to identify risk in their supply chains of those goods at risk of modern slavery. If we just go to the next slide, we are on the 31st of May 2026 at the third reporting deadline. So really you may have, been more familiar with the term S211, but the first reporting deadline for the Fighting Against Forced Labour and Child Labour and Supply Chains Act formally came into effect on the 1st of January 2024. So we're 2 years past the Act coming into effect and the third reporting deadline. So there have been a lot of modern slavery statements filed that we have learnt from to prepare for this third deadline. If we just go to the next slide. Who needs to report? So companies listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange need to report. all companies with a place of business or companies with assets in Canada that meet at least two of the following criteria in one of their two most recent fiscal years. So that's at least 20 million Canadian dollars in assets, at least 40 million Canadian dollars in revenue, and 250 or more employees. And so the first, if you haven't reported before, that is the criteria as to determining who is a reporting entity. And while I assume most of you on the webinar know if you are a reporting entity, it's also really important that you know whether your suppliers are reporting entities or not, because working with non-compliant suppliers actually elevates their risk of modern slavery. And so that's why I've reiterated who needs to report, because it's important that you know whether your suppliers are reporting entities or not. What needs to be reported? The company structure, activities, and supply chains. Now, this might seem simple, except it is very unusual for companies to have full visibility into their supply chains. A lot of companies understand who their own suppliers are, but what is required to be reported is identified risks of forced or child labor in your supply chain. So that's not just your suppliers that you have an immediate contract with, and this is the complexity of this legislation, which requires you to identify risk beyond your suppliers and deep into your supply chains. Then you need to report on the steps taken to assess and manage the risk and actions taken in the previous financial year to mitigate those risks. So you can't fix what you can't see, which is why supply chain visibility is so important, because those steps taken need to correlate to the actual risk, and those actions taken to mitigate the risk have to correlate to the actual risk. And so that's why we are going to speak about today the importance of identifying where the real risk is. Because what we know about modern slavery is, while there is those 69,000 people in Canada in forced labor, often modern slavery risk is hidden deep within the supply chain. The next reporting requirement is remediation for incidences of forced labor, including reducing the impact on those vulnerable families, and employee training initiatives on forced and child labor. Finally, how the company measures the effectiveness of its approaches and actions. If we just go into the next slide. It is really important. The scope of the Act is the focus on forced and child labour. And so that is really important because it doesn't cover forced marriage, rights of Indigenous people, gender-based and other discrimination, land rights, access to water, freedom of expression, and broader human rights issues. And so for companies looking at the risk of human rights issues, it's really important to delineate and measure forced and child labour for purposes of this reporting. It also includes goods, not services, so professional services, investments. It is a little bit different to Australia, because in Australia we have to identify risks in the supply chains of our investment portfolios. We're just looking at goods, the supply chains of goods, production and imports. A materiality versus salience is also a very important note on the scope of the Act, because what we're measuring is risk to people and not risk to business. So if you are in risk and compliance, it is really important to, I guess, take that risk and compliance usual measure off, where you're looking at the risk to business. What this Act requires you to report on is the risk to people, and the severity is assessed by the impact on human rights, not financial exposure. So that is a very different materiality. That is very different from the material risks that you are usually looking at, which is reputational risk, financial risk, and operational risk to the company. If we just go to the next slide. If you are not aware, you must submit your statement on or before the 31st of May, and all reports must reference the activities undertaken during the previous financial year. So I've just listed, what your financial year may be and when your statements may be due. If we just go to the next slide. So key lessons. So we've had the privilege of analysing a lot of the modern slavery statements that have been filed, and we've also the Public Safety Annual Report has really identified some of the learnings, and so you can see that the majority of organisations are identifying risks in activities and supply chains. But if we go to the next slide, what is really interesting is risk identification remains concentrated in raw materials, and also just at the first suppliers. So while there are a lot of hidden risks of modern slavery in Canada, if we take the example of an iPhone, it's very unlikely that the iPhone store in Vancouver or Toronto is exploiting their workers. It's likely that they're regulated by labor law. But what companies are not looking at is the deeper supply chain layers. So, for example, the cobalt that may be mined by child labor to put in the lithium batteries and layers down. So only 20% of entities are identifying risk in tier 2 of their suppliers, 16.2% in tier 3, and 15.1% beyond tier 3. And so a really practical tip is acknowledging that based on your supply chains, most of your modern slavery risk is going to be beyond tier 2. And so in your modern slavery statement reporting on your tier 2 risks and showing the regulator that you really have visibility over the deeper tiers of your supply chain layers, and that you understand what your supply chain is. And so if you haven't already, mapping your supply chain is the first step for this reporting requirement. If we just go to the next slide, this happened in Australia in the first few years that almost all organisations reports embedded responsible business conducts into policies, and we've seen the same thing happen in Canada. And so what is likely and recommended is to update supplier codes of conduct, to update contractual provisions, and have responsible business policies, which it looks like most organisations are doing. However, there is very rarely any enforcement mechanisms of those policies. And so that's actually in some circumstances causing more risk, because your suppliers are agreeing to your responsible business conduct policies, but there's no actual audits of them or looking at potential assessments of potential adverse impacts, and only just over a third of companies are actually taking any steps to mitigate. So that will eventually cause a bigger risk, because a lot of companies don't have any enforcement processes for them. So yeah, thank you. Nicholas has just said no actual enforcement seems to be the norm, and that is certainly happening. Certainly happened for the first few years in Australia, but these policies are often designed without taking actual procurement processes into account. So after a few years, what happened in Australia is what companies found were that these policies and the enforcement mechanisms, particularly relating to modern slavery, were not actually consistent with the due diligence being undertaken by their own procurement team, so purchasing due diligence. And so when there was inconsistencies in that, the policies were redesigned to be compatible with existing operational procedures, and enforcement improved significantly. If we just go to the next slide. Only half of organisations are assessing the effectiveness of ensuring forced labour and child labour not being used. And so while there may be policies in place, companies, as I said before, are not assessing their effectiveness, which is a requirement under the Act. And so for those who did, there is a focus on audits of internal policies, which is highly recommended. But only 37.3% of companies have tracked relevant KPIs and metrics. And I think what is really important is only about a third engage with suppliers. So companies should really, like when I talk about due diligence, which I am going to get to in a few moments, what due diligence is supplier engagement. So it's very hard to mitigate risks in your supply chain if you're not engaging with suppliers. And so supplier engagement can be done through supplier self-assessment questionnaires at the very least, but companies should be moving towards supplier engagement. Okay, if we go to the next slide, um, I'm going to share now some insights from Australia's modern slavery reporting regime as it relates to some of the insights over the last 3 years. And the objective for this part of the webinar is really to put into perspective how companies can practically really make some strong progress in each of the Canadian reporting criteria based on the learnings from Australia's modern slavery reporting regime. So, um, really, we've seen recently there's been a lot of high profile forced labour allegations in the Australian media. So, disclosure is not alone reducing risk, and it can actually increase reputational risk. And that's why it's so important that disclosure is actually backed up by substantive action from companies. You'll see Kmart, which is a huge department store in Australia, actually published their list of factories. And in that publication, while they were very transparent, there was links to suppliers in the Xinjiang region and allegations made about forced labor. And so you can see for this department store disclosure of their companies, while the purpose of this legislation is transparency regulation, the disclosure of where their factories were actually caused a action being brought against them. The Australian glove maker Ansell was accused of exploiting workers at a Malaysian factory, and Pacific workers are often treated very poorly, fearing deportation. So you can see that as the legislation has been around for 6 years in Australia, the media is actually increasingly reporting on these forced labour allegations. So, one of the key points that businesses globally need to start preparing, especially in relation to Canadian companies who export anything to Europe, is mandatory due diligence. You may have all heard of the CSDDD in Europe. The Australian Modern Slavery Act is likely to incorporate mandatory due diligence, but due diligence is the most effective way to show what you're doing to address modern slavery risk, which is a reporting requirement under the Canadian Act. And so primary there is no there are signals that this is likely to change globally. And if you are a company that is required to show what you're doing to address modern slavery, undertaking due diligence is the most significant step that you can take. If we just go to the next slide. There are some common reporting pitfalls in Australia that is similar in Canada, and so that is copy and pasting. So repeating prior statements without updating the dynamic content really undermines credibility and signals weak underlying systems. One of the things that applies equally in Canada is the aspirational statements of what you're going to do without the follow through. So putting future commitments that are not credible unless progress against prior commitment is evidenced is really not recommended. And the reason for this is that there are increasing risk of claims of misleading and deceptive conduct, which becomes a company-wide governance issue. And so companies, even companies with the best intentions to show continual improvement with their modern slavery response are really, there may be resource constraints or budget constraints and reasons why they can't do what they set out to do. And so putting it in a statement that is approved by the governing authority is really increasing the risk. Having the empty catchphrases like generic language, such as continuous improvement, lacks value without context, explanation, or demonstrated change. And then really these modern slavery statements are not good citizen content. They really should be treated always like regulatory compliance reports, not a broader social impact statement. Okay, if we just go to the next um, slide. In Australia, there was an appointment of a federal anti-slavery commissioner. And as I said before, businesses are being driven towards better due diligence as a key strategic priority. So sending out supplier questionnaires so that you can actually map your supply chain and identify the risk deep within the supply chain is key. Is really key to showing an adequate modern slavery response. We just go to the next slide. Okay, so the priorities for Canadian entities to prepare for the next reporting deadline. If we just go to the next. Oh, sorry, the key pillars. We recommend that the following steps are essential to build a robust, effective, and modern slavery framework. So actually listing these as priority areas in your modern slavery statement: governance and policy, training, risk assessment, due diligence, external engagements, and grievance and remediation. So as we saw before, companies are really at just stage 1, 2, and 3 in Canada. But in terms of showing what the companies are doing to both measure effectiveness and address modern slavery, more of a focus needs to be put on 4, 5, and 6. If we just go to the next slide. So I'm just going to go through each of the pillars, and these are the really practical examples of what you can be doing to prepare your modern slavery statement. So understanding what your clear governance and policy framework, showing that you have clear ownership and accountability, and credible intent to address forced labour and child labour risks. So whether this is a working group within your organisation or embedded into an existing governance and policy framework, that should really be a document that is auditable and included as an example in your modern slavery statement. And so we do recommend clear governance structures, a supplier code of conduct, and a modern slavery statement. If we just go to the next slide, your employees should be providing training on forced labour and child labour that's actually relevant to your company's supply chain. So really the company-wide modern slavery training needs to be targeted because those in your procurement teams will be identifying very different risks to your executive team. And so I've used examples. If you're a professional services reporting entity, we would be focusing on the procurement of property management services, and the supply chain for goods like computers, electronic staff uniforms. So in those circumstances, basic training should be provided to all staff with a more detailed training to the procurement team. On the other hand, if you're a construction company, we would be focusing outreach to the actual construction workers. They may be more vulnerable migrant workers or subcontractors, and it's important that it is an appropriate format and language adapted to them, whereas then there would be really pragmatic training for recruitment personnel. If we just go to the next slide, all companies should be conducting a risk-based, and again, like I said before, that's risk to people of the organization supply chain. And so doing a comprehensive mapping of your supply chain really helps prioritize those due diligence efforts by identifying the highest risk sectors, supply industry categories, and business models and supply chain tiers, but remembering to do that beyond tier 1 of your supply chain. And I've just put a reference up there, which is the OEC due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. And that guidance recommends that you start with a high-level picture of your supply chain, then gather information, fill the gaps through consultation, and identify the most significant or salient risks to focus on that more in-depth due diligence. Okay, if we just go to the next slide, embed targeted due diligence. So we always say don't take a blanket approach, take a targeted due diligence approach. So moving from a broad screening to a targeted prioritization. As I said before, due diligence just means supplier engagement. And so really mapping out full supply chain, pinpointing industry categories and supplier locations with elevated risk relative to the company's supply chain, and building upon risk assessment, broad brush, and due diligence measures to inform selection of that focus area. So if you just go from, yeah, okay, so Um, here is an example of due diligence actions for multi-year implementation. And so what this is showing is that you don't actually do the same, sorry, just a moment. You don't actually do the same due diligence for all of your companies. So for elevated risk suppliers, what would be appropriate would be on-site auditing, worker interviews, supplier third party certification, and also maybe a long-term anti-slavery partnership. This is very, very different to what would be appropriate for moderate risk suppliers, which would be supplier specific desktop auditing, targeted supplier disclosure requests, collaborative supplier engagement, and periodic individual supplier monitoring. For low risk suppliers, supplier self-assessment questionnaires, periodic supplier monitoring, collaborative training, and awareness raising. And so you can see from this slide here, the blanket approach of due diligence is not actually the best approach. Different due diligence, different levels of due diligence is required for for how each supplier is ranked. And so if your company is a construction company, has a high prevalence of, say, low-skilled migrant workers, it is probably best to do worker interviews, look at third-party certifications, and that's very different to companies who have identified low-risk suppliers, which we would recommend doing a supplier self-assessment questionnaire. Okay, so if we just go to the next slide. Collaborate through external engagement. And so organizations and individuals should really work together to identify, assess, and address modern slavery risk. And so what we've seen in Australia is there are industry working groups where there is a sharing of non-competitive information, that a lot of companies are using the same suppliers, and the pooling of resources to get better value for money and increased leverage has actually really enabled them to assess better expertise and insights for better decision making. So one of the things that we're working on in the energy industry in Australia is an EV human rights working group. And so it is really good to I guess, set an industry standard, both use materials, templates, policies. That's something that I would highly recommend. Okay, if we just go to the next slide. Building grievance mechanisms and remediation processes. And so this is something that companies should implement, because in circumstances where they have policies identifying modern slavery and addressing modern slavery, if there's not a formal complaint process that's accessible to vulnerable members of a workforce and affected communities, that actually enables those individuals and groups to raise legitimate concerns, then it's very difficult for any effectiveness to be implemented. And so companies really need to take a commercial position on what that grievance mechanism is, whether it's accessible to high-risk workers, and also what the process of remediation is in circumstances where there is a group of victims, survivors, or affected individuals. So It is a requirement under the Supply Chain Act for organisations to report on any measures they've taken to remediate. So this isn't an optional thing. You must actually report on the remediation to the loss of income to the most vulnerable families that result from any measures taken to eliminate the use of forced labour. And so, in examples of that may be financial compensation, it may be published formal apologies, and it could be a framework to prevent future harm. Okay, if we just go to the next slide. Um, Fair Supply, as I said, is a technology company that is backed by world-leading subject matter expertise. We've taken our years and years of learning and created a technology that maps your supply chain, identifies forced and child labor risk, and then undertakes the due diligence for you. So if you would like to be ready for your reporting on the 31st of May, there is a QR code there. Okay, I think that leaves us plenty of time for the discussion and questions. Does anyone have any questions? No, no questions. I can't see. Oh, we do. Okay, yes, the recording will absolutely be available after, and you'll get some email correspondence with the slides. If anyone wants to ask a question, my colleague will unmute you. Any info on First Nations? I don't have any info on First Nations. Mark just has his hand raised. Hi, Mark.
Yep.
Thanks
Hi.
for
Hi,
thanks.
everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. That's great.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So, I mean, how long is this process if you have like, I mean, our company's in professional services and we have a few offices across Canada and we have like, I would say over 1,000 different suppliers depending on our customers' need. Like
Yeah.
when we go through and get price, how long would that process take to go through and I would say give a questionnaire to all these different suppliers that we have?
Yeah, so we've actually automated that process. So we have a 2 week turnaround period for those suppliers. I think what the timely process is, if you're not using some type of automated SAQ, is that somebody internally actually has to review and assess the responses. That's why in the first couple of years of the Australian legislation, there was someone in a team who was actually reviewing the responses and scoring them. And for 1,000 suppliers, that was taking months and months and months. There was a high margin of error. And it was very labor intensive. And so we've automated that the surveys go out, and as they are responded to, they're automatically scored in a dashboard.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? No. Okay, well, if we just want to put the QR code slide back on, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I could talk about this all day, and we would love to understand where your organization is at. What part of Australia has more slavery? It's probably, given Australia's geography, more industry based. So the agriculture industry has significant amount of modern slavery risk, which is both East and West Coast. Great. Thank you so much.